Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, I have been thinking about one of our previous episodes quite a bit lately. That was episode 60 on generative AI, because one aspect of generative AI, ChatGPT, has been all over the news lately.
Oh, yeah, I know it.
Yeah, Microsoft invested in OpenAI and are planning on building ChatGPT into their search results. That's currently in a closed beta that some people are writing about. And Google is racing forward with similar capabilities on its end because they see this as an existential threat. But what really captured my attention was an article I saw yesterday in which the IBM CEO said that chatbot type services similar to ChatGPT would be taking jobs away from copywriters and editors, but that we shouldn't worry about that because he considers those jobs to be boring and unfulfilling, similar to factory work. And so people will be grateful to no longer be doing that work.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And yet earlier in my career, I had those jobs. I have been a copywriter. I have been an editor. And if that were me today, I don't know that I would be feeling liberated. If an algorithm were to take my job, I feel like I would be concerned. Like, if this job is beneath me as a human being, then how am I supposed to pay my rent and put food on the table?
Right. Yeah. What a condescending attitude that is, what you just mentioned. And I completely agree with you. People take pride in things like editing. I mean, that's a very prestigious occupation. There are famous book editors, you know?
Sure.
But AI is definitely in the news. There's a front page story in the New York Times today by Kevin Roose, the wonderful New York Times tech reporter who I quoted at length in my answer to your question about AI a few weeks ago. And he basically is looking over the new Microsoft chatbot and has observations about how creepy it is. He got into a personal chat with the chatbot, and the chatbot was trying to convince him to leave his wife for the chatbot. And it's printed, the back and forth is printed on page 1 of the New York Times today.
Yeah.
It's really creepy.
Yeah, and we do go deeper into this in the episode, so if any of our listeners are interested and haven't yet listened to that episode, I do encourage you to go back. But I think people just don't understand what they're dealing with. They are not dealing with a machine intelligence that is actually trying to seduce searchers. They're dealing with an engine that makes a statistical prediction of what a good answer to a question is. And so there's no meaning infused there, but it does lead into some unexpected and, possibly unsettling directions.
Yeah. And, we anthropomorphize our dogs and, why not anthropomorphize our chatbots too? So
exactly.
It's just natural.
Speaking of things that are natural, let's segue to the topic of aging.
Segue, yeah.
Another set of headlines I've been seeing recently, and when I Googled it, I can see that those headlines have been popping up periodically over the past 4 or 5 years, is just the question, should we treat aging as a disease? And initially, my response to those headlines is to answer that no, aging is a natural part of life and should be embraced rather than something that should be pushed away as far as possible, and that we should just accept our mortality. That's my initial philosophical response.
Yep.
But I am aware that maybe I am wrong about this. Maybe there are certain things about aging which we think are just a natural part of the aging process, but which in fact are treatable conditions that are entirely unnecessary. So I sent you down that rat hole and asked, should we be treating aging as a disease? And what did you find?
The answer is yes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's it for this week.
Yeah. I thought this was the lightning round. But all kidding aside, this is a serious subject, and it's one of the hottest questions in medicine right now. Aging has been described in the academic literature as the climate change of healthcare. Given that 16% of the world's population will be senior citizens by 2050, up from 9% in 2019, I think that's an apt metaphor. So here's a little roadmap for my answer, Mark. First, I want to explain why we're even having this conversation. Then I'll address the best arguments I came across both against and for treating aging as a disease. Some of these arguments are subtle and require detailed explanation for laymen like you and me, so I'm going to do my best to make them understandable. Where relevant, I'll work in some history to help explain the origins of certain views. I already teased my answer in my joke at the top, but I'll say more about that at the end.
Okay.
All right?
Yep.
Okay. Why are we having this conversation? The formal classification of diseases dates back to the 18th century, and the first international classification came out in 1893. In 1948, in an attempt to standardize the diagnosis of disease, the World Health Organization began publishing a catalog of known medical conditions, diseases, and mental health disorders called the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, the ICD for short. The diagnostic categories in the ICD form the basis for recording and tracking statistics about illnesses and the official causes of death noted on death certificates. A disease's appearance in the ICD is integral to establishing private, nonprofit, and even congressional grant funding for research into developing biomedical procedures to treat or cure that disease. The diagnostic coding, in particular, is integral to reimbursement by health insurance. So what's called a disease is important. Let's put a pin in that for now, because I'm going to come back to that later. The 11th revision of the ICD was adopted in 2019 and came into effect in January 2022. The WHO had proposed substituting the term old age instead of senility as one of the diagnostic classifications, and to define aging-related as, quote, caused by pathological processes which persistently lead to the loss of organisms' adaptation and progress in older ages, end quote. There was an understandable desire to retire the term senility because it hadn't been used much in recent decades due to its increasingly negative connotations.
Right. Something that we touched on in our episode on dementia.
Yes. The substitution of old age as an officially sanctioned diagnosable disease stirred up an immediate and wide-ranging backlash from practitioners of geriatric medicine to elder affinity groups, NGOs, and other organizations at all levels of society. Ultimately, in response to the global uproar, the ICD retracted the term old age as a disease category, replacing it with the phrase aging-associated decline in intrinsic capacity, which refers to how aging affects all the physical, biological, and mental capacities that a person draws on. But just because the semantics were resolved in the ICD doesn't mean the debate is over. It was raging in medical and scientific, even philosophical circles for half a century before finding its way into the ICD. So let's move on to the arguments on both sides, starting with the arguments against treating aging as a disease. The first argument just seems like common sense. We know that aging is genetically coded and occurs across virtually all species. There are actually a few living things like hydras that don't seem to age, but let's put them aside. Aging is therefore a natural process experienced by everyone, as opposed to disease, which is a deviation from nature in that it affects only some. Indeed, disease is a 14th century word whose medical definition is, quote, any harmful abnormality of bodily structure or function, other than those arising directly from physical injury, end quote.
Right. And anything that affects everybody is by definition normal.
Yes, exactly. The belief that disease is distinct from aging traces its roots to the 2nd century AD in the classical Greek physician and Roman citizen Claudius Galen. Though there were some philosophers and scholars before Galen who took a contrary view, the mainstream view in Western thought since Galen and until well into the 20th century was that aging and disease were entirely separate processes. It wasn't until 1954 that anyone dared to call aging a disease complex. Now, it's also certainly true that not everyone ages the same way. Chronological age alone is not a good marker for disease risk. Aging is what scientists call a plastic process, plasticity being the capacity of organisms to vary in their development, behavior, and outcomes depending on environmental conditions. In other words, lifestyle choices matter. Here's a couple of simple examples to make that point. A 48-year-old heavy drinker and smoker might have a biologically older body than a 72-year-old non-smoking teetotaler.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, two senior citizens who grew up near the Chernobyl nuclear disaster might have very different health outcomes. That's also due to plasticity. If disease is not an inevitable consequence of everyone's aging, then how can aging itself be a disease? Might the purveyors of so-called longevity medicine be painting with too broad a brush? Keep in mind also that for all the venture capital money being poured into the reversal of aging, we've yet to see a single intervention that's clinically proven to slow the rate of aging or disease progression in humans. Until we see some FDA-approved treatments, aging as a curable disease is mere speculation, and it's arguably just another fad like cryptocurrency for rich idiots to sink their money into.
Yeah, like previous generations of rich idiots who had their heads removed and frozen so that people in the future could thaw them out.
Yes, and I'm going to mention one of them soon. Yes. Now, there's some evidence that individual aging mechanisms play a causal role in many illnesses. For example, the cellular process of senescence, in which certain cells stop dividing and replenishing themselves later in life, is the cause of a pathology like age-related cardiovascular disease. But it's also the cause of pathologies that don't lead to disease, like freckles, or the wrinkling of your skin when you get older. Sadly, the popularity of facelifts and tummy tucks suggests that we already treat wrinkling like it's the disease. But the point holds that not all aspects of physiological aging lead to disease. And then there's the false hope argument, that classifying aging as a disease suggests that it might be preventable or even curable, which opens the door to the snake oil peddlers. There's already a booming market for anti-aging potions, most of which are, in the words of one expert, quote, intentionally false, misleading, or exaggerated for commercial reasons, end quote. Such products have not only separated gullible consumers from billions of dollars of their money, but their existence also makes it difficult for the public to separate phony marketing from genuine scientific research. We need the wishful thinking public to understand that there are no magic solutions to aging. Apropos of that last point, there's also a moral or characterological dimension to this debate, and I think we are well advised to be skeptical about some people's motivations. Is this movement to treat aging as a disease just a scam? Is it catering to people's primordial fear of dying and the gullibility of well-heeled folks like Ted Williams, who authorized his family to cryogenically freeze his decapitated head in the hopes of, who the hell knows? The British journalist Brian Appleyard amplifies the point you made in your question about how treating age as a curable disease perhaps reflects some people's unwillingness to accept their own mortality. In his book, How to Live Forever or Die Trying on the New Immortality, he writes, quote, there is a deep and absolutely unavoidable selfishness involved in the idea of immortality. Billions have lived and died. Why should I in particular be immortal? Why should I persist in being?
Yeah.
End quote. The bioethicist Leon Kass echoed Appleyard's thrust when he wrote, quote, "Confronted with the growing moral challenges posed by biomedical technology, let us resist the siren song of the conquest of aging and death," end quote.
Right.
After all, as the old saying goes, nothing is certain except for death and taxes.
Yeah, particularly if the treatments for death, if the treatments for avoiding death are so expensive that they're reserved to the richest among the rich, then you're basically exporting death to the working classes.
Yes.
And that's the plot of a dystopian novel right there. That's not a future that any of us should imagine.
Yes, and that's another argument against treating aging as a disease, and I'm going to mention that. Incidentally, living longer isn't even particularly popular. According to polling from the Pew Research Center in 2013, when American adults were asked whether they personally would choose to undergo medical treatments to slow the aging process so they could have a life expectancy of 120 years old or more, 56% said no. 51% thought such treatments would be a bad thing for society, and 66% thought, probably correctly, what you just mentioned, Mark, that in practice only the wealthy would have access to such treatments.
Right.
That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of longevity medicine.
It isn't. And can I ask how you would have answered that question?
Well, it's interesting. Before I researched this topic, I would have said, no, absolutely not. I don't want to live that long.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm not so sure, and you'll understand why as you hear more of what I have to say, especially on the other side of this argument.
Okay, so let's circle back to it at the end of your presentation.
Yes, please, let's do that. Of course, what we call a disease is subject to the prejudices of the time. We all know how homosexuality was classified as a mental illness until deep into the 20th century. I think it was 1974 or something like that when it finally got stricken from the literature.
Right.
I'll bet you didn't know that in antebellum America, escaped slaves were thought to be suffering from a disease called drapetomania, whose underlying hypothesis was, quote, the belief that slavery was such an improvement upon the lives of slaves that only those suffering from some form of mental illness would wish to escape, end quote. With that as our historical context, we should think long and hard about literally pathologizing a universal process like aging.
Yeah.
That might make it seem toxic, potentially exacerbating the scourge of ageism, which is already widespread virtually everywhere you look,
right,
from Hollywood to the presidential race to our own workplaces.
Right. If age becomes a choice, then it would be so much easier to discriminate on the basis of it.
Right. According to a March 2021 report issued by the WHO, 1 in 2 people globally are ageist. And many in the medical community believe that older people have been shortchanged for decades vis-a-vis their health-related rights, even before such tendencies became even more explicit during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
So you can argue that the last thing we need is for one's chronological age to become a pre-existing condition leading to age-related discrimination.
Yeah. Like just as an example of that pops into my mind, if you have hypothetically 2 candidates for a heart transplant and one is 65 years old and the other is 15, 99.9% of people I think would say give the heart to the 15-year-old because he's got so much more to live for. Like there's so much life in front of him. And so we discount the value of the life of someone who we think is at end of life, that you've only got a few years left. And so you're just not worth as much. You have less life to live. You have less love to give. You have less productive years in front of you. So you are not as important, not as valuable.
Absolutely true. I couldn't agree more. Before we pivot to the other side of the debate, it's worth noting that humanity has been remarkably successful in the last couple of centuries in creating advances in medicine, food production, and public health that allow human populations to live longer. As people live longer, more and more of us experience age-related diseases. We need to remind ourselves that the increasing number of people living long enough to contract things like cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, cataracts, neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, or cancer for that matter, is a side effect of our incredible progress in lengthening life. That may also explain why majorities in the Pew survey weren't too keen on living longer. And this is what I meant when I said, you asked me the question, how would I vote? Before I did my research, I would have said no, and this is why. If the poll respondents believed that a longer life expectancy meant living with painful and debilitating age-related conditions like cancer and rheumatoid arthritis for 30 plus more years, then of course they wouldn't be interested in that.
Yeah. I personally would have lots of follow-up questions. It's not a simple yes or no for me because I have lived through 2 parents in dementia, and I have no interest in putting the people who love me through that same experience, particularly if it was infinitely prolonged.
Yes.
I see no value in spending 30 years in a hospital bed. If those are 30 good years, then sure, we can talk about that.
Agreed.
But if it's 30 years of mental and physical decline, then no thank you.
Yeah. What people would sign up for, I think, is a longer period of healthy life, free of the morbidities that plague so many old people today. Not a longer lifespan, but a longer health span. And yes, that's a real word that I'd never encountered before researching this topic. It's now one of my favorite words, health span, and I'm going to come back to that several times. What if I told you that a longer health span is exactly the outcome sought by the practitioners of longevity medicine?
I would say that that's the proper topic of research, so I salute them in that.
Yeah, and that's my segue for moving on to the counter-arguments, that treating aging as a disease is not a crazy idea, and that walling off aging from disease is a false dichotomy. All the late life misery that aging populations experience today has led some scientists called biogerontologists to think about the underlying causes of aging and whether they can be decelerated. That's not nearly the same thing as reversing aging or seeking immortality, which is the domain of the lunatic fringe and sci-fi writers. Biogerontologists think criticism like what I read earlier from Brian Appleyard and Leon Kass is a red herring. Richard Farraher at the University of Brighton wrote that, quote, both Appleyard and Kass, in different ways, treat immortality as a state humans could achieve. Medical immortality is then held up to ethical scrutiny and found wanting. But since immortality is a state that humans can never achieve, all the authors are offering is, at bottom, a moral critique of Never Never Land, end quote. Kass, the bioethicist, seemed to grant Farraher's point when he wrote, quote, some, of course, eschew any desire for longer life. They seek not adding years to life, but life to years. That's a nice turn of phrase.
Yeah.
Continuing with Kass's quote, this has much to recommend it. Who would not want to avoid senility, crippling arthritis, the need for hearing aids and dentures, and the degrading dependencies of old age? End quote. I think that's a much better description of what the proponents of longevity medicine are trying to accomplish. Now, before we go any farther, I want to clarify just what we mean by aging, because that word has many definitions. I'm not talking about aging as the accumulation of wisdom and experience that we get from having lived a long time, which is clearly a good thing. I'm talking about a more biological definition, like this one offered by Farraher. Quote, the operation of processes within whole organisms that result in an exponential increase in the chance of both death, mortality, and sickness, morbidity, with the passage of time, end quote. A synonym for that definition of aging is a word I mentioned a few minutes ago, senescence, which is the process of deterioration and exhaustion at the molecular and cellular level that increases physical vulnerability and leads to age-related disease. That deterioration arguably fits the definition of a harmful abnormality of bodily structure or function that we call disease. That's why the medical consensus that's been ascendant since Claudius Galen is shifting, with aging increasingly seen as a disease process in itself, not just a benign progression that increases the risk of disease. But let's back up for a minute. Why do living things age? The theory about why aging evolved dates back to the 1930s and is tricky to understand, but I want to try to explain it because it bolsters the argument for why age should be treated like a disease. I want to acknowledge the work of biogerontologist David Gems in helping me to articulate this. Okay, here goes. Evolutionary fitness is a function not of living to a ripe old age, but of reproductive success, right? We kind of understand that already.
Yeah.
Evolutionarily speaking, aging doesn't contribute to fitness, so it appears to serve no real purpose. In humanity's ancestral environment, death in the wild from external causes like starvation, predation, or disease meant that very few individuals survived long enough to develop senescent pathologies, i.e. age-related diseases. As recently as the 19th century, life expectancy across Europe averaged less than 40 years. It wasn't until the last century or so that humans lived long enough to get old the way we understand that term today. Aging reflects a decline in the force of natural selection against mutations that exert harmful effects later in life. I want to say that again because that's a mouthful, and then I'm going to explain it. Aging reflects a decline in the force of natural selection against mutations that exert harmful effects later in life. Now, here's what that means. Inherited mutations that cause severe illness in childhood reduce the chances of reproduction and therefore gradually disappear from the population. But a similar mutation that surfaces after a person's reproductive years is more likely to persist precisely because it has no effect on one's reproductive success. Through that prism, aging can be seen as the consequence of evolutionary neglect as opposed to evolutionary intent. Because the early life effects of genes have much stronger influence on fitness, natural selection sometimes favors mutations that improve fitness early in life but reduce one's fitness later in life. As a result, populations accumulate mutations that exert harmful effects at the end of the life cycle. Aging can be described as the sum of those effects. Aging is basically a complex, multi-factor, multi-systemic genetic disease that differs from other genetic diseases in that we all inherit it. Contra Claudius Galen, the universality of aging doesn't mean that it's not a disease. It means that, as David Gems put it, it's the greatest disease of them all. How about that? I'm fascinated by that idea.
So when we all learned back in college biology class that the basic principle of evolution is survival of the fittest, what that actually means is survival of the fittest up through childbearing years.
Yeah.
And after that, there's no evolutionary force. It's you carry whatever you have to your grave, and your genes are already passed on to the next generation. So even if you've got something that triggers a terrible disease that kills you at the age of 50, if you already have children, there's nothing that evolution can do to pull that gene out of the population.
Yeah, there's nothing that evolution will do because the struggle is for reproductive fitness. So all these pathologies are like the collateral damage.
Right.
From the striving for reproductive success. To underscore the problem of aging nowadays, Richard Farraher cites the statistic that, measured against a biogerontologist's standard benchmarks for successful aging, namely the avoidance of disease, the maintenance of normal bodily function, and social engagement, only 18% of people are undergoing successful aging. With more than 4 out of 5 of us doing poorly in old age, there's a huge constituency that would benefit from advances in this area. Indeed, one really good argument for treating aging as a disease is that the status quo of rigidly separating the two has led to such bad outcomes for so many. What we have today is a completely reactionary healthcare system that devotes 32% of total Medicare spending to the last 2 years of life, ineffectively treating patients with chronic illnesses without improving their quality of life.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money wasted and a lot of misery tolerated.
Right.
There's got to be a better way. I've come to believe there is a better way. Richard Farraher, the guy whose definition of aging I cited earlier, thinks there are 2 ways to improve people's prospects as they age. The first is obvious. We need to keep pushing primary prevention methods to extend health spans by postponing the onset of age-related illnesses. Quitting smoking, or better yet, never smoking in the first place, is a good example of primary prevention. So is using sunblock to prevent the slow accumulation of solar damage to your skin. The second thing we can do is to better understand how aging works. Focusing on the mechanisms of aging instead of all the age-related diseases would be a paradigm shift in the way we deal with aging. Researchers like Farraher strongly suspect there's a lot of overlap between the processes underlying common age-related diseases like cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. They posit that if we can study aging like we study those diseases, we might someday develop drugs to delay many or even most of them. The former chief medical officer of the FDA, G. Alexander Fleming, believes that treatments focusing on the underlying aging process could, quote, in one fell swoop, intervene in several or many chronic diseases of aging, end quote. I want to flesh this out because this is really a profound idea, I think. As I mentioned earlier, formally coding something as a disease in the ICD leads to grant funding, health insurance reimbursement, and other forms of investment. We know that aging increases one's risk of developing a host of non-communicable diseases. But if the aging process is not classified as a disease, it's harder to research because the funding spigot might be turned off.
Yeah.
Even if aging itself isn't coded as a disease category, having the ICD classify specific aging processes and age-related precursors of pathology is the next best thing. I'll give you an example. Aging is associated with body frailty, as measured by decreased resistance to external stressors and the gradual diminishment of what the medical journal The Lancet calls intrinsic physiological reserve. There's ample evidence that frailty is a strong predictor of mortality, independent of age, sex, and comorbidities. Frailty and muscle loss, the medical term for which is sarcopenia, was classified as a disease several years ago after a robust lobbying effort by the longevity medicine community. Adding more codes to the ICD for aging processes potentially unlocks the money to organize clinical trials and develop drugs that target those processes. It also addresses disparities in the way we currently fund medical research. Today, funding earmarked for specific age-related diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's far exceeds that devoted to studying aging generally. Since old age is a risk factor for nearly all the diseases that are likely to kill us, beefing up research on the underlying biological processes of aging would lead to treatments that address the causes of aging, not just its effects. Addressing root causes would have downstream benefits in our treatment of effects. Advocates of this approach believe that targeting pathways associated with aging could lead to finding and potentially mitigating or even curing the numerous seemingly unrelated diseases that plague old people. One of the fringe benefits of thinking of aging as a disease pathway is that you can check whether drugs already used to treat specific age-related diseases can be repurposed to treat other diseases. For example, clinical trials are already underway to see whether the diabetes drug metformin has any effect on other age-related diseases. Success in such trials could change the face of medicine. It paves the way for doctors to work in a holistic manner to slow the body's aging process as an endpoint in and of itself, as opposed to combating numerous age-related illnesses that occur in different parts of the body, a situation with which many of us with older relatives are familiar. With, say, the oncologist treats their cancer, the dermatologist treats the melanoma, the rheumatologist works on the arthritis, the pulmonologist works on the COPD, not to mention all the pills prescribed by each specialist.
Yeah. In my father's last year of life, I took him to a new dentist, and they asked for a list of his existing health conditions and prescriptions.
Yeah.
And it ran for page after page after page.
Right.
It was like a medical manual in itself.
Yes, it's staggering. I've also seen that in my own parents' treatment and my father-in-law's treatment. Though we've hardly scratched the surface of what's possible from this paradigm shift in the way we treat aging in humans, that doesn't mean there haven't been advances. Scientists like David Gems are having success slowing the aging process in laboratory animals like the tiny nematode worms Gems works with. Altering certain genes in these worms has led to an astonishing 10-fold increase in their lifespan.
Wow.
Tinkering with the same genes has been shown to increase the lifespans of flies, rodents, and fish, though less dramatically. Guess what, Mark? Humans carry these genes too.
Yeah. And so just to flesh that out a little bit, is that something where if you had enough money, you could go in and get gene therapy where they inject you with something that will deliver these new genes into your cells and you're possibly live for 600 years? Or is that still science fiction?
Well, two things. First, we're not there yet, but I think there may come a day where those treatments are clinically approved, and what they're likely to do is lengthen your health span. You won't live forever, but the diseases will be kept at bay for longer than they are today.
Yeah. And shouldn't your medical insurance encourage you to get that treatment because they would end up paying for so few other treatments? Like, doesn't that make total sense for them?
Yes, but we need to classify aging as a disease in order to unleash medical capitalism to make this happen.
Yeah.
So let me try to wrap this all up now. From what I can tell, biogerontologists have their priorities straight. This is not about arresting aging, seeking immortality, or even living a 120-year life. Successfully delaying the pathologies of human aging is ultimately measured by something more important. As David Gems put it, quote, "Decelerating human aging would reduce disease on an enormous scale, but the success of any medical treatment should be gauged in terms of the degree to which it extends a healthy lifespan." End quote. There's that concept of health span again.
Yeah.
Writing in The Lancet, Kieran Ribeiro argued that, quote, "Increasingly, healthy aging is recognized as a fine balance between maximizing intrinsic capacity and enhancing social and environmental supports, all aimed at optimizing the older person's functional capacity, autonomy, and independence." End quote. These researchers know that lengthening people's health spans by eliminating or at least delaying the start of grave and potentially fatal age-related diseases like cancer or heart disease is the pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. We discussed the metaverse in a recent podcast. Mansplaining number 58, everybody, if you want to take a listen. It's still very much a theoretical construct. You have to imagine what it will be like in the future. The breakthroughs that await us in longevity medicine also require imagination. So imagine this. Imagine your doctor prescribing you one pill that you'd take regularly, beginning in middle age when you're still safely inside your health span, maybe around the age you and I are right now. This pill would slow your aging process with minimal side effects. It would provide protection against a full spectrum of age-related illnesses from that point forward, though it wouldn't eliminate them altogether. It would extend both your health span and your lifespan without expanding the term of dependency and disability at the end of your life. This is the type of thing I've come to believe is possible if we commit as a society to treating aging holistically as one disease instead of a laundry list of unrelated ailments. It's pretty safe to say that pill won't be available in time for you and me, but I think it can happen someday. So Mark, I ask you, would you sign up for that future? Because I know I would.
Maybe it says something about me, but mentally I'm in another dystopian novel. And in this one, that pill is available, but the pharmaceutical companies are sending out hit teams to shut it down because they make so much money from the medications that they sell for other conditions that are connected with aging.
Or they'll just charge so much money that only the Elon Musks of the world can afford that pill.
Yeah. I would be intrigued, certainly. What I've seen my parents go through has made me much more afraid of aging than I was before. I'll just be frank and open about that. Something that would offer me a reasonable assurance of at least a greatly reduced likelihood of experiencing the same thing myself, or seeing, for instance, my wife experience that. That would be a pretty compelling sales pitch. It would be hard for me to say no to that.
Yeah. You know, my father, through age 75, was a pretty healthy guy. Even though he smoked for a lot of his adult life, he was pretty much ailment-free until he hit 75. And then at 75, he started to get every last thing, and he was dead by 82. And the last 7 years were not particularly great, right?
Yeah.
So I think what the biogerontologists are envisioning as the future, this is the future that they sold me on, is that your healthy lifespan may go 20, 30 years longer than that 75 years that my father experienced as a not particularly healthy guy who smoked, right?
Yeah.
He had 75 years. What if healthy people had 95, 100 years of a health span, and then the inevitable happens? They may still end up with dementia. They may still end up in hospice, right? But their health span has been lengthened. Their happy, healthy life is extended. That's a really intriguing future that I think might be possible with the right reorganization of our priorities.
Well, I'd like to see it. I do think that we as a society do kind of have a trouble with aging, with the concept of being old. There's so many jokes that are just leveled at old people because they're gray and wrinkly, and so much love directed to young, sexy people because they're young and sexy, that we do kind of need a philosophical makeover. But if we can be healthy while having those conversations, I have no trouble with that.
Yeah, so to repeat what I said at the top, yes, the answer is yes. We should treat aging more like a disease.
Okay. But it's too late for you and me.
Too late for us.
Oh, well.
Too late.
Well, thank you for that. That was very informative. And I feel like my question was answered. You expanded my perspective on this question.
Yeah, and I thank you for the question because it was really interesting. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, my trajectory, rarely do I go into questions Even your most esoteric questions, Mark, I usually know where I stand kind of at the beginning, and it's kind of reinforced by the time I finish the research. But on this one, I completely changed my mind. And that's a fun thing, too.
Yeah. Well, that's the essence of mansplaining. The interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn.
Yes, right. Yes. All right. Well, I've got a question for you for next time. You ready for this?
Lay it on me.
Okay. So one thing I hate about the political discourse in this country is how ignorant some voters and politicians are about the concepts they discuss.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of things like, keep your government hands off my Medicare, or the internet is a series of tubes.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
Oh, yes, I do.
Or how about this one? If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
Yes, legitimate rape. I'd forgotten about that one, so thanks for bringing it back to mind.
Yeah, well, I could have picked 100 other examples. You would think people would shut the hell up about things they know nothing about.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, despite the stiff competition, I think there's a new contender for the most misunderstood, misused concept in politics, and it's critical race theory.
Oh.
Now, I'm pretty well read, Mark, as you know, and I can't tell you what that is. So I'm willing to bet that very few people in public life can either, and especially not Governor Asshole in Florida. This situation cries out for mansplaining. So, Mark, tell us, what's critical race theory, and why has it been such a lightning rod for political controversy?
As a desperate nation turns its eyes to mansplaining. Please, we have these questions about critical race theory. Could you answer them for us? And yes, I will get on that. I have done a little bit of reading on that, but I will go much deeper, and then I'll come back with an answer to your question.
Yeah, I really think a coherent explanation of critical race theory is something that all of us should hear, because we're just not getting it in the public discourse right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank you for spending the time. If you have comments or questions on things that you heard, if you have attitudes towards aging as a disease or not a disease, an excellent place to raise them is on our Facebook page, which you can find at Mansplaining the Podcast.
If you have that pill I alluded to, if you have that pill and are willing to make it available to Mark and me,
yes,
we're all ears.
Yeah. Is there a post office box where we can send cash? For every episode, we post a little snippet plus all of our sources. It's a great place to check out the material behind the episode and also leave comments or suggestions for a future topic. If you would like to do us a nice thing and help grow the mansplaining audience, the small but mighty mansplaining audience, the best way to do that is by going to your podcast player of choice. So that could be iTunes, it could be Spotify, it could be Google Play, it could be Amazon. Wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast, if you could go in and find Mansplaining and give us a 5-star rating and a review, we would dearly love it. I was on iTunes earlier this week, and I looked up Mansplaining, and Joe, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we have 9 5-star ratings there.
I did not know that.
So 9 people.
Well, I don't get the
9 people out there.
I don't
Thank
get the
you very
podcast there, so that explains it. Yeah, I will look as soon as we're done.
Not a single review that's not 5 stars. So everybody loves us. That's the takeaway that I'm taking from that, is that everybody, absolutely everybody loves this podcast. So thank you. And we love you too. But that's it for this week. I'm Mark. That was Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
We'll talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.